Hello and welcome to the European Report. Here we are in the heart of Europe, in the European Parliament, to discuss three major issues today. The first issue we're going to discuss today is the growing increase in anti-Semitism. In the past year, we've seen a 45% increase in anti-Semitic instances across France. Also, the French security forces have warned this week that there are 100 of dangerous Islamists that pose a threat to the Jewish community. We'll also be discussing the US presidential elections and what will a Mitt Romney president mean not only for Israel but also the Middle East. And finally, we'll discuss the issue of Iran and Iran's nuclear weapons program. And today I'm joined by Thomas Sandel, the director of ECI, the European Coalition for Israel, and Inav Heyman, who is representing the European Friends of Israel. Thomas, welcome to the programme. It's good to have you back on the programme. Can you just share what you've been up to in the last couple of months? Because I know that you've been doing a lot of work in the UN in New York.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. It's good to be back in the programme. It's good to be back in Brussels because, as you said, it has been a busy 2 months. And just a few weeks ago, we came back from New York, where we had the opening session of the 67th General Assembly. And as the viewers will know, one of the hot topic on the agenda was the Palestinian statehood bid. And because of the fact that all the attention was on Iran, there was not much progress last month, but we do expect already next month that this will come back on the agenda. It will be debated, could possibly even be a vote. I call this issue as being part of a diplomatic war, because this is not war in a conventional setting, but it's a war with words. And I think nevertheless, it's so important that we who are friends of Israel, supporters of Israel, understand how we can engage in this war. And our way of doing it, again, is through educating and reaching out in advocacy to the leaders to explain that this is not just a small detail. It may seem like a small detail, a small upgrade of a Palestinian membership in the UN, but if it would be accepted, it would clearly redefine the name of the game. And as the chief negotiator said the other day, if they would be accepted as a non-member state, it would mean that the Palestinian territories would no longer be only disputed territories, but according to his interpretation, it would be occupation of another UN member country.
Poses quite a few problems, so I think we'll come back to you on that one, Thomas. And Nav, it's good to have an Israeli on the panel for this time. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? What's like growing up in Israel? I know that you've worked in the Israeli Knesset and now you're here as the director of European Friends of Israel.
Growing up in Israel is, I think it's a theme for an entire show. But yeah, I worked for about 5 years at the Israeli Knesset for 3 different parties. So I worked for the Labour, Kadima and Lieberman. So I really did the entire Israeli political spectrum. And then I moved here a bit to work in the European Parliament. This is how everything brought me to this current position as Director of European Friends of Israel, where I can try to bring Israel and the EU closer.
Yeah. And what are the challenges you've had in this job in terms of Israel advocacy?
Well, the 2 main challenges are trying to sell Israel to the European, but also to sell Europe to the Israelis. Sometimes I don't know what's more difficult, because Europe is perceived in Israel as someone who is traditionally, if you want, on the Palestinian side, condemning Israel, even if it's not always true in terms of economic agreements, political agreements, etc. This is the perception the Israelis have.
And because the Israelis feel closer to the Americans culturally and also politically as well.
Yes.
Is that a problem in really engaging Israelis with Europe?
I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge we're facing every day. But I'm also overwhelmed with the support that we find for Israel within this institution, the European Parliament, and the other national parliaments in Europe. So I would say it's a challenge. It's not an easy road to walk on, but we're working on it.
Excellent. And Thomas, what are the challenges you've faced advocating for Israel at the UN? Is there an increased hostility, or what's the current climate there in New York?
Yeah, well, I think compared to last year when this issue was, again, a very hot issue and the main issue, I actually think that the situation today is slightly better for a number of different reasons. I think one is the overall radicalization of the Middle East. The other, and perhaps the most important factor, is I think the world are realizing slowly but surely that Ahmadinejad is a clear danger not only to Israel but to mankind. And when you listen to his speech at the UN General Assembly, and when he started to get excited in his speech at the end, speaking about world chaos, disaster, which would eventually bring in the 12th Imam, I think, one or two Europeans who come from a very secular background, they will start to scratch their head and say, well, what on earth do we have here? Is this a person that we can entrust with nuclear capabilities? So I think what I'm saying is that this actually did work in the favor of Israel. I think the Israeli Prime Minister had a much easier time selling his message, which he did, I think, PR-wise in a wonderful way, graphically, like a teacher to say, well, this is the red line. And this will always remain in the eyes of the viewer to see that graphic illustration, 90% a red line, we cannot cross this line. And Ahmadinejad actually did a much better PR job for Israel than any Israeli could do. So in that respect, we have to almost thank him.
Yeah, but one question, this really does lead to the point of, really does lead to a leading question, that why does the UN allow someone who calls for genocide against another nation state, also sanctioned the essentially ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people, called for that, also acquires nuclear weapons and is #1 sponsor of international terrorism. Why is someone like that given a platform at the UN? Surely there should be actually credentials before anyone's able to speak.
Well, Simon, that this is exactly the point that we have brought up with the United Nations, to say that Holocaust denial should be banned at the UN, full stop. And it doesn't matter who would be the person denying the Holocaust. Regardless of nationality, it should be banned, full stop. Nevertheless, I mean, the UN, of course, is a complex mechanism, and knowing the basics of international law, it's not an organization where there are any type of qualifications to become a member. Someone once compared the UN to an organization where half of the members would be, groups like Hells Angels and criminal motorcycle gangs. And it may seem like exaggeration, but there's some truth to it. A majority is not parliamentary democracies like in the Western world. But I think the UN, nevertheless, it does bring everyone together to the table. And I believe we need a fora such as that. I should also say, and this is to give credit to the UN and to Ban Ki-moon, when he was speaking at Tehran in August at the non-aligned movement, he made it very clear what was acceptable at the UN and what was not acceptable. And we, of course, listened very carefully to the speech of Ahmadinejad, also to note that in his official address, he did not deny the Holocaust. He did not call for the destruction of the Jewish state. So I think also here we need to be balanced and say that I believe there are at the moment developments going in the favor of Israel, of understanding the environment that Israel is facing in the Middle East.
And Nav, I just want to bring you on this one. This brings closer to home here in Europe. Now, there's been shocking reports coming out of France, particularly a 45% increase in anti-Semitic incidences, and there's a climate of fear that's really casting a dark shadow over the Jewish people in France. What do you make of the growing rise of anti-Semitism in France?
Look, ever since the Mera massacre in Toulouse, you see an increase. You say 45%, you don't have, when you have 4 incidents a year and then you have 6 or 7 incidents a year, so you will see an increase. But let's not forget, France is the biggest Jewish community in Europe today. And when you mix it with a crowd of 6-7 million Muslim immigrants, you will have clashes. I don't think France is an anti-Semitic country. I don't think France ever was an anti-Semitic country. They were the first country to, give emancipation to the Jewish citizens. Statistics, we have to. Someone once told me statistics. It's like it's like a bikini. It shows everything, but it hides the most important fact. And the most important thing here is that France is not an anti-Semitic country, and I wish all the governments in the world would do the same efforts as the French government is doing by keeping the Jewish community safe.
Yeah. And how are the French government keeping the Jewish community safe?
Well, first of all, I think the head of the CRIF, the Jewish organizations, is meeting the French presidents more than anywhere else in the world. They're in such a good relation. It doesn't matter if it's right, left, if it's Hollande, if it's Sarkozy, it doesn't matter. They're in such a good relationship, and you will see outside of every synagogue, outside of every Jewish school, you will have a police booth, you have a police car. It shouldn't be that way, but these are the efforts the French are putting into keeping the Jewish community safe.
Yeah. And Thomas, I mean, there's been a lot of reports coming out this month, particularly detailing the Jewish community and certainly fears that they have. There's almost a climate of fear over the French Jewish community, with so many Jewish people now in France making aliyah to Israel, to the United States. How serious do you believe this problem is?
Well, again, representing a European coalition for Israel, I have to look at the whole European picture, which of course is complex. I'm not in any way an expert on France. I don't live in France. I don't claim to know the situation in France particularly well. Nevertheless, I would probably be slightly more pessimistic than my friend from Israel. And I think it's only fitting that the European should be more self-critical, and Israeli, of course, would try to see the positive things. But being a European, I would have to say that I am concerned even more so this year than last year because of what we see, not only in France. Again, France is one country. You have new developments in Germany, you have situation in Britain, you have situation getting out of hand in the Scandinavian countries. So you have a mixture of political cultures where still we see the same tendencies. See, in the past, we would always explain a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe to saying that there's a particular, that the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians have come to a clash. So, southern Lebanon, Gaza, you saw an increase of anti-Semitic violence in Europe. At this particular moment, the interesting thing is that we don't have a war situation. So you have to look at the explanation somehow, find some alternative explanations. Some would say, well, we have a financial crisis. My tendency would be to say that as much as we have a radicalization in the Middle East, we are seeing expressions of it also in Europe. And this is partly, I think, how we should explain the rise of anti-Semitic violence all across Europe. Again, this does not explain the situation in Germany, where there's no interference or influence of the Muslim immigrant community, where German political leaders and legislators come to the conclusion to say that circumcision cannot be allowed anymore. So on one level, we have this very intellectual discussions where there's no, the interesting thing here is that here you have Jews and Muslims together being targeted for a way of life. And somebody would say that this is anti-Semitism, which is motivated by, quote, human rights and social justice. And I think this is just as much as we are concerned about what happens in France, this is the issue which comes from traditional European society, the intellectual class, using human rights, children's rights, as an argument. in repackaging anti-Semitism in the new format. And as someone said, I think it was the head of the World Jewish Congress, he said to the Germans, he said, "Don't come and tell us how we should be Jews. If you take away circumcision, I mean, how can you live a Jewish life in Europe anymore?" This is serious stuff. And it's only adding to the other scenarios which we are seeing across Europe.
And Anav, Israel has faced, decades of dealing with Islamist insurgents, terrorist threats, but this is something new to European Jews, particularly in light of what's happened this year. We had the horrendous attack in Toulouse of a Jewish rabbi and his sons, including another child that was shot and killed. Only last month we had a grenade attack on a Jewish grocery store in the heart of the Jewish community in Paris. There is a sense that maybe this situation is becoming out of control. I mean, we've had the French security forces really say there's something like there are hundreds of Islamists that are willing to carry out attacks, and these are homegrown Islamist terrorists in France.
Yeah. It's true. These are homegrown. These people are third generation already in France, but they do not assimilate within the French society. And you see, it's a social problem that is drifting towards a religious problem. You see the rise of extreme Islam not only in the Middle East, but as Thomas said, in all of Europe. And this is affecting these people. And when you have the imams preaching in the mosque on a Friday to take action against, the Zionist entity or Israel, for them every synagogue, every Jewish school is like an Israeli embassy. It's different than what's happening in Germany. It's two different things. I mean, Germany, if you want to say it's classic, old school European anti-Semitism, this is more related to a clash of civilizations between the West and the East, rather than proper anti-Semitism.
Yeah, but what does this really say about the Islamist threat? Do you believe that European governments, the European Union, is taking the Islamist threat to Europe seriously?
I think they're starting to understand. Now they woke up. They woke up maybe 20 years a bit too late, but they're starting to wake up. They're starting to understand the threat. It took bombings in London and in Madrid and murders like in Toulouse to understand that they have a real problem. They're starting to address it. It's not easy. It would be easier if Europe didn't have democratic countries. But as everything is democratic, which is great. You have legislation. You have processes that don't take one day to accomplish. They will get there. They're starting to wake up. They're on the good path, and I think they should help each other.
Yeah, and Thomas, just in my notes here, it said the French government believes that the Islamist problem, comes from the indoctrination in prisons, distribution of Islamist propaganda via the internet, and satellite television is radicalizing young, impressionable Muslims across Europe. And what policies do you believe that the European Union can put forward, including member states, to actually tackle this problem?
Well, I think in the very place where we are today, in Brussels, the European Parliament and the European institutions have a role to play, because as we have stated already, this is not a national problem. It's not limited to one particular country. It's a typical European problem. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that actions have already been taken when it comes to broadcasting of hate speech. I think it was Al-Manar, the Hezbollah-inspired TV channel that had to, if I'm not mistaken, again, that had to shut down at one point. But I think it is the role and task of the European Commission to monitor not only who gets permission to broadcast, but what is the actual content. And if the content is in violations of European rights, that is universal rights, I think it is up to the European institutions to take actions. The dilemma, of course, have been, when you look at broadcasting and responsibilities, is you can say, well, this is being broadcast in one country outside of EU, and it's not punishable under European, particular European legislation. Again, we have the whole internet. How do you regulate the internet? I mean, we can shut down satellite broadcasts, but it doesn't stop the internet from living its own life. And I know that the Israeli government and many other organizations have a particular concern. Again, it's a difficult dilemma. How do you regulate, some would say, free speech? How do you regulate the internet? You can't. So again, I think it's an issue that should be brought up on the agenda here in the European Parliament, in the European Commission. I think we can only find a solution when we start to realize that we have a major problem. Because I would agree with what you were just stating, that the radicalization, of course, comes through feeding through broadcasts which are inspired not by the truth, not by our values, but by incitement and hatred. And we'll have to find a way of stopping this or limiting it. But it's not easy.
And what lessons can the European Union learn from Israel? I mean, we're here in the European Parliament. To get in the entry, you have to register at the desk, then you've got to go through security, you have to go through scanners. But this is an everyday occurrence in Israeli life, particularly if you want to go to a shopping mall, you want to go somewhere with the threat. What lessons do you believe that member states of the European Union can actually learn from Israel's experience in dealing with terrorism threat?
Well, it's hard to say because it's not the same playground, it's not the same game. Where in Europe you have homegrown terrorism coming from Islamist cell. In Israel, it's more neighbors. You have less homegrown. You had cases where you had Israeli Arabs, meaning Palestinian with the Israeli citizenship, committing acts of terror. But these are very, very small numbers. Majority of terrorism happening in Israel comes from the Palestinian Authority, from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon. It's a whole different game. So it's hard to say. I wouldn't come to the European and say, okay, we can teach you how to deal with terrorism. I think they should more consult with the Americans that are also always trying to confront homegrown terrorism, if it's from the far right or from Islamist groups. So I wouldn't come into the Europeans and say, okay, you can learn from us how to deal with terrorism, because they could say, look, I don't know if you dealt with it so well. So
yeah, and Thomas, this seems to be the issue, isn't it? That we've got a problem that's emerged over the last decade, and that is homegrown terrorists in native European countries. I know that Britain has faced this problem. When Britain faced the terrorist attack on the 7th of July 2005, they were homegrown terrorists. They were not known to the security services and able to carry out those attacks. Now, clearly they would have had outside help, but isn't it a concern or a worry for the future security of Europe that there is a growing Islamist problem that is leading many young, impressionable Muslims across Europe to want to enter into jihad, and then one step further to actually get involved in terrorism?
Obviously, it is a problem. We have a dilemma, as you've just noted, in a free, open society. The easy way, of course, would be to clamp down, irrespectively, knowing that many innocent people would go down, together with those who are actually posing a threat. In Europe, in particular, it is a delicate issue. Again, I'm not a security expert. I don't think I have much to add on that level, but where I think we can play a role, and that includes the viewers, is that we're all shaping public opinion. And I think as the famous quote goes, that evil in itself is not the problem, it's the passivity, the negligence of the good people to state the obvious, which is the problem. It always was, the same in the 30s, same in the 40s. And I think here what we are trying to do, the European Coalition for Israel, is to educate and give instruments in the hands of people, that they would have the facts, they would have the background material, and they could start themselves to raise their voices. So if they see incidents, if they see threats, if they see values which are not compatible with universal values being expressed, broadcast, or through violent acts, they will have to speak up. And this is how democracy works, of course. The paradox often is that I meet, for example, many elected members. They're wonderful people. They have very good values. They agree on me on most issues. But then they said, well, listen, when it comes to election times, I have to be re-elected. And the people out on the street, they don't like what we're talking about right here. It may seem reasonable between the two of us, but how do you communicate with the masses? And here, it's only the masses themselves who can communicate within themselves. So I believe in people power. And just as much as we've been speaking about an Arab Spring, I'd like to see a European Spring, when people would not violently oppose the institutions which we have in our society, but where they would go back to the values which once made Europe and the Western world great. So we need a renewal and a revival in that respect of our democratic institutions.
And also looking at the European Union here, we've had Baroness Ashton has made some very, very strong comments in the recent past concerning Israel. Isn't there a problem with very much the left, with intellectuals on the left, that equate the threat of terrorism to Europe with the Palestinian problem?
It's an everlasting question if it's the threats of the world terrorism is related to Israel or not. Let's say you don't have Israel tomorrow. Let's say tomorrow Israel disappears off the map. Ahmadinejad had great success with his mission. Do you think terrorism will stop? Do you think this is where Al-Qaeda will drop their weapons and say, okay, now we can live in peace with the American? There's always, there's the small devil and the big devil, as Bin Laden used to say. Israel is only the small devil. For him, America is the big devil. And why stop here? I mean, all the Western democracies for the radical Islam are devils. So trying to link between the two is a bit naive. It's something, okay, it's the easiest to say. It's very easy to say, okay, accept all the Palestinian refugees, go back to 67 lines or 48 lines, whatever is, depends where you are on the political map, and where does it stop? I mean, if you could sign an agreement with someone saying all intercultural violence will stop, why we sign an agreement and we go back to the 67 lines? Or you know what, the Israelis go back to Europe or the Arab countries where they came from. Will it stop? No one will sign an agreement like this.
Thomas, the next issue we really want to discuss is November's presidential elections.
Sorry,
yeah.
Could I just say a few words on the issue which you raised, because I believe it's so important. And it's interesting, again, it's old anti-Semitic myths being repackaged. We heard that before. If only the Jews would disappear, it would be, in the 30s, Jews go back to Palestine. And now, once they are there, say, well, Jews go away from Palestine, go back to Europe. So always the tendency seemed to be, if we can only fix this Jewish problem. Well, why is it a problem always? Things will go well. So I think always when we hear an explanation like this, which we sadly hear in intellectual circles today, if we can fix the Middle East, everything will be fine. It's nonsense. And history has proved it, again and again. It doesn't work this way. So we need to, and I think increasingly more politicians are starting to do it, to refocus and say, listen, there are other problems that we need to fix. We cannot always use Israel as an excuse. I just want to be that, to make it very clear.
No, it's good. Which will probably lead me on to say something else, Alandav, and that's the issue is, do you believe, thanks to the Arab Spring, and we see the horrendous violence taking place in Syria with the civil war taking place there, we've seen the political turmoil in Egypt and across North Africa and the Arab world, is there a realization now that the centre point of the Middle East problem always was quoted Israel and the Palestinian issue is now much a wider issue.
Well, yeah, it's obvious that now Israel is not even a factor in all this Arab Spring. It's all, inside the countries. So, for the first time, when there's things going on in the Middle East, it's not related to Israel, which is, in my opinion, great. But we have to see, what tomorrow brings, and we have to see where the area is going. You see already in Egypt that, it's might be democratic, but it's very bad for Israel. Might be good for the Egyptians, I don't know, but it's very bad for Israel. And you see, Israel and Egypt moved from having a cold peace to having practically a ceasefire. This is what the state of things are. You have no tourism, you have no trade, you used to have loads of gas flowing from natural gas from Egypt to Israel. That stopped as well. In a year or two, Israel will produce her own natural gas, and even export to other countries. And you see the agreement, the peace agreement that was signed in the 80s is almost not valid anymore. I mean, the most important part of the agreement was the proliferation of Sinai, that you wouldn't have troops or heavy machinery of the Egyptian army, only allowed to have police there. Now, in 2005, when there was the disengagement from Gaza, the Israelis asked the Egyptian to help to stop the smuggling of weapons and other things to Gaza through Sinai. So the Egyptians said, we only have police. So the Israelis agreed that they will replace the 750 policemen they had in Sinai, which is about 3 times the size of Israel, to 750 members of the border police, which were better equipped and better trained, etc. What they did was just to add and not remove any. And then a year later, they said, okay, we have a problem from the sea, so can we build a naval base? The Israelis said, okay. Then they said, Sinai is too big. We cannot rule it with infantry. Please allow us to add some helicopters. So they added helicopters. As soon as you had the Arab Spring demonstrations in Tahrir Square in Egypt, Mubarak said to the Israeli, I have lots of problems in Sinai. Allow me to put 6 regiments into Gaza. The Israeli said, okay. So now you have about 2 divisions of Egyptian army in Sinai, and this is beyond what's agreed in the agreements. And this is, the Israelis said yes, 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 and now we're facing an army who is well trained. There are about 1 million soldiers, which is huge numbers for the Middle East. They have American equipment, American financing, and in all the wars that Israel ever had, the Egyptian army was always the most dangerous one, and the most precise one, and the one that caused the most casualties to the Israeli side. So this is something we have to take into consideration.
Yeah, and Thomas, obviously the program's going in a different direction, which is a good thing. When it comes down to Egypt, we've seen the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. We've seen the Muslim Brotherhood president, Mohammed Morsi, win the elections, and we've seen there a clampdown on freedom of press and academia. Is there a great fear now? We've heard from Alandav the fear that Israel has from the emergence of the Arab Spring and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. But how is Europe waking up to the dangers of the equivalent of the Taliban taking power on Europe's doorsteps?
Again, I spoke with a very initiated expert the other day who was of the opinion to say that Europe is finally waking up, again, one year too late. Because when we initially discussed the Arab Spring, it was all, everything's going to be fine. Europe needs to finally get their act together and support the good guys. And he said, well, it seems like it's only now when the facts are there on the ground, you can't neglect them anymore, that people are starting again to have second thoughts. And it's again, once you made mistakes so many times, how do you ever get it right? Because if you look at the European institutions here, first they supported Mubarak, first they supported Gaddafi. He was greeted, he was hugged together with the dignitaries in this house. A few months later, he's disgraced. They said, well, we never knew this guy. Who is this guy? We always hated him. He was corrupt. Come on, this is not how you get the trust of the people, of the electorate. Again, what happened then is to say, well, since we messed up so completely the first time, let's get it right this time. And again, I think they made some major mistakes. You don't always assume when you fight evil that it's only the good people who can fight evil. And you should always take into consideration what can come after an evil government is an even more evil and even more corrupt government. So I think for Europe, in a way, it's a bit of a backlash now. I said, well, how can we secure our trust and legitimacy, having failed so many times over the last 10 years? And I think it's the role, again, of organizations like the European Coalition for Israel, being a grassroots organization, putting pressure on the legislators and said, listen, we have to have very clear guidelines of what is acceptable. Where do we draw the line of governments that we can support through European mechanisms, be it aid or technical help? And there can be no compromise. We can't go back in time like what we see in Europe, where women, where minorities of different persuasions are just being treated like second-class citizens, even more so than under Mubarak. So if you ask the Christians in Syria today, in Egypt today, the Copts, how is your situation now? You'd be surprised to hear how systematically they are being not only marginalized, but by attacked both verbally and physically. I spoke with a member of this parliament yesterday who said that he has reports from villages in Syria, which have been traditionally over the years, hundreds and hundreds of years, Christian villages, which are completely occupied and under the influence of Al-Qaeda today. You hear about this nowhere. It's not being raised in media, and it's not being raised in the European Parliament. So again, it is a matter of keeping intact the integrity even of the European leaders. And I think, again, the only lesson I can think that we learned is that compromise, seeing between the fingers, will never get you anywhere. Sooner or later you have to put down your feet and say, well, this far but no further. These are the values that we will back. If you don't apply with them, sorry, but we'll have to make it very clear.
Yeah. Which really takes on to the next subject, really, and that's the US presidential elections next month in November. How critical are these elections for the future of the Middle East and the future for democracy in the Middle East?
Well, in my opinion, it won't make a huge difference if the president will be Romney or Obama, if it will be a Democrat or Republican. You look back in history and you see, can you say George W. Bush was better than Bill Clinton? Absolutely. To Israel? Absolutely not. Might be equal, but you never saw generally a Republican being better to Israel than a Democrat. So I'm being very conscious about saying, this would be better, this would be less bad, this would be less good. Look at Netanyahu, in my opinion, did a mistake. When Romney came to Israel, he embraced him and he endorsed him like it's obvious that he's the next president. At that time, you had the polls for Romney, then he fell, now he's back on the horse again. It's, Shimon Peres said once, polls are like perfume, it's nice to smell, but don't drink it. So on this, I think he made a huge mistake because he's gambling. And the only thing worse than gambling is gambling with other people's chips. And now he's gambling with all of the State of Israel chips on a candidate. I'm not saying if it's the wrong candidate or the right candidate, but the fact that things like this should not be gambled on. I mean, look at Obama signed just a few months ago, a new agreement with Israel selling bunker buster bombs and F-35 stealth fighter to Israel. These elections are not even about the Middle East. They're not even about foreign policy. I mean, they're almost not discussing Iraq or the Middle East. It's about the economy. It's only about these elections will rise and fall on the American economy. And as soon as we understand this in the Middle East and we try not to take sides, would be better.
Yeah, I think Bill Clinton in the '92 presidential election campaign said it's the economy, stupid,
Exactly.
which matters to American voters. But the fact is that America is the world's superpower, and foreign policy.
He was a great president for Israel, even though he focused his whole campaign on the economy. So I don't think it will matter if it will be Romney or Obama on this matter. Israel was always a bipartisan issue in America. The person who made it partisan now is Mitt Romney, by saying Obama is not in favor of Israel. Because of Obama, the relations declined, etc., etc. So it was never a bipartisan issue. Never you would see in the campaigns, I'm less for Israel, I'm more for Israel. Israel was a consensus in American politics, and this is the way it should stay.
Yeah. Thomas, I want to bring you on this one. I know that you've been in New York recently. There is a growing perception, particularly amongst American Jews and evangelical Christians that support Israel, that Obama is adopting policies that are anti-Israel, and like Anandav was saying, that the issue of Israel was never a party political issue, but it's become a party political issue. And Romney's made some very, very strong statements in support of Israel and accusing the President Obama of putting Israel under a bus.
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, of course, I agree with my friend is saying. In the US, we have a unique situation where this is a non-partisan issue. When you go to the Congress, nevertheless, I would probably be a bit more critical to the track record of the current president. I don't think he has been supportive of Israel. I don't think his policies in the Middle East have been very helpful. I don't think his speech in Cairo was a helpful speech. I think, in fact, that it initiated many of the processes which later led to the radicalization of the whole Middle East. But so you have, on the one hand, you go to the Congress, and I think that's where the Israeli Prime Minister sometimes plays it very safely. You know, you can always bypass the president by going directly to the people or the elected members, and they will, cheer you. I do agree with you that Israel should never meddle in domestic policies in the U.S. An election should never be seen as a pro or anti-Israel elections. Nevertheless, I mean, living in a free, open democracy, I think one would have to look at the facts, not to speak so much about his opponent as to speak about the current president, to say that I don't think he has been very helpful. Just looking symbolically at the facts, he hasn't visited Israel. He did not receive the Israeli Prime Minister prominently in the White House. Come on, you just can't get away with that. And I mean, I can say this again, not being Israeli, not being Jew, being European. These are my observations. Nevertheless, with Mitt Romney now, he's very pro-Israel, but we've seen in the US, this is how you win votes as well, and this is how you win over a critical Jewish electorate. But it remains to be seen, and there I agree with you, it remains to be seen what his policies would be if he was elected. The question is then, who would be his advisors, who would be in the cabinet, and there are many question marks.
Yeah. And that really leads us on to American foreign policy. I mean, you're saying there's not much difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in terms of policy. But if we look at President Obama's policies towards the Middle East, we've seen the emergence of the Arab Spring, which offered the hope of democracy, reform, freedom of press, freedom of speech. But in the end, it's turned out to be nothing but an Islamist tsunami that's taken place. And we've seen the decline of American power and influence in the Middle East. Surely this can't be a good thing.
Yeah, but I think it's a byproduct, the lack of American involvement in the Middle East, because that's what it is. It's not that they're getting involved and encouraging the Muslim Brotherhood to take power, but it's mostly the lack of American intervenence in the Middle East. You know, Obama is in deep trouble with the economy, with his health bill, with all these things, and you know, looks less towards the Middle East, etc. America is still very involved in all, you know, corners of the world. So I don't think it's something deliberate. I don't think it's something that he's planned. I don't think it's something that has to do with the fact that he's a Democrat or is part of his world perception. Okay, his Cairo University speech was a bit milder towards Israel and more supportive towards Arab Springs, etc. But at the end, it's things that are less related to the Middle East that affected it, rather than direct intervention.
Yeah. And Thomas, I mean, what would be your desired outcome of the elections? Because I think Mitt Romney's made a very, very clear distinction between him and President Obama when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. He's called for military intervention by supporting the rebels in Syria to take Syria away from the Iranian axis. He's calling for Iran, that if Iran crosses the red lines in terms of their nuclear weapons program, then he will use American force and power, and said he's exactly on the same page as the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And he claims that Obama has really isolated America in the Middle East with devastating consequences.
Again, I'm not a military expert, I'm not a security expert, and the last thing I would like to do is to give advice to the future US president from this studio. But on a more general level, I think that what we say matters. How we position ourselves matters. Sometimes, and that's the beauty with diplomacy, you can speak in a way that it is understood by those who would want to oppose you, and in 90% that's all what it takes. So once you have clarity to say, well, this is where we stand, these are the red lines, we are not taking the military option off the table. I think that is enough sometimes, and let's face it, it's a bit like a poker game. You know, you play with your cards, you don't show them, you don't let your opponent know how far you will go. But a good card player will never say that, well, listen, this is something that I will never do. I'll never hurt you, I'll never attack you, and of course this is off the table. You don't do that if you're serious and if you mean business. And I think in this respect, what I hear coming out from Mitt Romney, regardless of if he would carry through what he is, you know, saying now in the last few weeks before the elections, but nevertheless, I believe that a political message is important as such. And there, again, I believe that the current president made a mistake of showing to the whole world that the Israeli Prime Minister was not really welcomed or appreciated in the White House. You know, of course, you have millions and millions of people in the region who will read and hear him more loudly than whatever he's going to say in his speech later. And I think these are the type of mistakes that you can't really afford to make as the president of a superpower. Again, I'm staying away from that race. I think the Christian approach here is to pray for those in authority, regardless of who they are. But again, you know, we have to use you know, our sound mind to just look and compare and vote according to our convictions.
And whether
Just on that. If I remember correctly, Obama said that all the options are on the table, and this is the exact words he used. So in that case, you know, I'll give him the credit that, you know, if one day Israel needs him on the Iranian issue, I'm talking about a military strike, he will be there. Nevertheless, you know, Elie Wiesel once said, always believe the threats of your enemy more than the promises of your friends. So, you know, the Israelis, they have to take care of themselves. They might not have all the technological capabilities, military capabilities to do 100% work. And I do believe that, like before, the United States will stand behind Israel.
Can I just quickly comment on that to say that, yes, I believe it's important to say in this studio that Obama, even the Obama administration has been much, much more clear and helpful to the Israelis than the governments, and particularly the European Union and their chief foreign policy chiefs. So we should, you know, put things in perspective, looking towards Washington.
And it doesn't matter really who wins the presidency, whether it's Mitt Romney for the Republicans or whether President Obama's re-elected. Still, the main foreign policy challenge of this generation is Iran's nuclear weapons program. How critical are we now in terms of Iran's development of those weapons and capabilities, do you believe?
I don't know. You don't know. I don't think anyone in this world besides Ahmadinejad and his experts know. The Israelis might know, the Americans might know. I have no idea. Anything I would say would be just a presumption. But let's say they're closer than what we want them to be. And this is the main thing, and this is why we need to continue to press Europe for sanctions, America for military backup, and basically use all the weapons we have, hard and soft, to just stop that program, or divert it towards the, you know, forget the one.
The critics of Israel have accused Israel of having a nuclear weapons program, and their argument is if Israel has a nuclear weapons program, which claims doesn't have officially, everyone knows she does, and saying, well, if the Iranians have them, why can't the Iranians have nuclear weapons? Can you just paint the picture of why it's so dangerous that Iran is not allowed to develop nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a matter of you know, where you aim. And this is, in my opinion, a difference where, and I take the example of Gaza and Israel. When the Gazans are firing missiles towards Israel, it's, you know, they don't target the army, the military. They don't target. They target civilians. They, you know, and the more the merrier. Whereas when the Israelis attack in Gaza, they target their target, which is the people who are firing towards Israel or ticking bombs. Sometimes there is collateral damage, and it's horrible when it happens, but for me the most important is where you aim. And it's the same with nuclear weapons. I mean, no one in his right mind in the world will doubt that Israel is holding or not nuclear weapons for self-defense.
And Thomas, I mean, there's been many reports, particularly about the threat of a nuclear Iran. But if Iran does develop nuclear weapons, surely this is a game changer in the Middle East, which will not only lead to a proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also means that Iran could continue support for international terrorism without the threat of being attacked in response. Is Europe aware of the nature of this, that this could disrupt oil supplies? We know that relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia are hostile at best, and that if Iran does develop nuclear weapons, this changes the whole dynamics of Middle Eastern and European security.
I think they do. Today I would say that they do. I think the economic sanctions are working pretty well. More can be done. We have to understand that Iran is in a deep crisis. Ahmadinejad is in a deep crisis right now. The currency is on an all-time low. There is opposition growing in the country. My hope and my prayer is really that he would somehow be toppled from the inside. And again, I think that's where both the Europeans and Obama did a great mistake when there was the Iranian uprising, that they did not clearly support it from day one. Let me also say in closing perhaps that just a few weeks ago, I so happened to be in the headquarters of the Iranian delegation in New York. And you ask the question, you compare with the Israelis and the Iranians, it's a bit like saying, well, if you have a weapon, does it matter if a sound, stable person gets a weapon? You can trust him. He may be a hunter. Do you give a weapon to a suicidal person who has apocalyptic vision to kill not only himself but the people around him? No, you don't. There is a difference. When I looked into the eyes of those people who were there, including the Iranian foreign minister, I never seen people so demonically motivated ever before. And I think the determination and the conviction which they have, which are driving them, is something which is unseen of in world history. With the Russians, a Russian did not want to die. That was not an mean in itself. It was nothing glorious for a Russian under the Cold War to die. But here we have people who say, well, if we can bring about an apocalyptic vision and bring in the 12th Amman, things will get better. He's not only whispering this, you don't have to read between the lines. He said it clearly a few weeks ago in New York. This will bring in peace to the world community. And as I say, I think the Europeans, they get it, they're doing everything they can. I think the determination to do even more is there. So in this case, I want to end on a positive note when it comes to the European leaders. I think they are doing everything they can and will do even more in days to come.
Gentlemen, I just want to thank you very much for joining me today on the European Report, and I want to thank you all for watching this programme. As we approach the US presidential elections, we see that there are vital issues relating to the Middle East that are at stake, and it doesn't really matter who wins, the same problems are still going to emerge, and that's why we need a stronger international effort to counter Iran's nuclear weapons programme in order to preserve a nuclear-free Middle East. So thank you for watching today's programme.